Picture this: a black single mother, head held high despite the weight of the world, steps into a supermarket only to be met with a vicious insult. "Think you're special," a man sneers, spitting in her face as blood pools on the floor beneath her. The crowd's cold stares and mocking laughter pierce the air until she pulls out her phone, her voice a fierce whisper, "Call now, right now." 3 minutes later, a black SUV screeches to a halt, and the entire police force freezes in their tracks. Who answered that call? How could one phone call unravel an entire system? Stick with us to uncover the jaw-dropping truth behind the price the system paid. The West End supermarket door glides open with a faint hiss, like a secret being let out into the humid night. The air carries the gritty scent of sun-baked concrete mixed with the faint rot of forgotten trash. Malikika steps inside, not rushing, but not lingering either, each step a testament to a will forged in fire. After a grueling 12-hour shift, her body screams for rest, but duty keeps her moving. Her left hand clutches her bag strap, anchoring her against exhaustion, while her right hand grazes her hair, brushing her forehead as if to measure the toll of the day. The fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the white tiles, stark and unforgiving, like a hospital corridor in the dead of night. It's the kind of light that lets you see everything but feel nothing, cold, clinical, and just shy of safe. The store is a ghost town, silent except for the hum of the coolers. Which city of the United States are you watching from? Drop a comment and share with us if you've had any run-ins with the HOA. We'll narrate your story on our channel. Goods were arranged neatly, almost mechanically, as if the items themselves knew no one wanted to touch them at this hour. The self-checkout area had its lights turned off with a closed sign hastily taped to the counter. Only one register was open far in the back, where a cashier was counting change, tapping the coins against the table, the sound of metal clinking against empty surfaces, void and weary. The creak of an old cart rolling on the tile echoed and scattered, burst just enough to emphasize the isolation. Malikika stopped at the dairy aisle. She pulled out a carton of whole milk, quickly scanning the label for the expiration date. Her movement was precise, without a wasted breath. She wasn't buying for herself. She was buying for Jalan, her 6-year-old son, who was fast asleep in the car with his worn hoodie draped over him like a cocoon. Jalan often woke up startled if he couldn't find her. There was a time when he cried uncontrollably just because she'd gone out to throw away the trash without telling him. Since then, Malikika had learned to return before he opened his eyes, like a small act of salvation amid days where nothing was certain. Malikika wasn't used to complaining. She didn't have time for self-pity. Life for her was a series of tasks: wake up, take Jalan to school, work 2 shifts at the hospital, return home when it's dark and cold, find her son asleep on the kitchen table with unfinished homework and an empty stomach. There were days when she didn't even remember what she had eaten, and it didn't matter, because she had chosen this, not because there was no other choice, but because she refused to allow herself the luxury of breaking down. Being a single mother didn't make her weak, it made her alert. Sharp, colder than the blood-soaked emergency room shifts, every decision carries consequences. Every time she lifted her head, she risked being knocked down. But if she lowered her head, who would teach Jalan to stand tall? Who would teach her son that he wasn't born to apologize for his existence? Jalan had never known who his father was, and Malikika had never apologized for that. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. She only owed her son a better world, or, if she couldn't give him the world, then at least a day without fear. That was why she worked herself to the bone, never argued, never begged. She didn't back down, not because she was meek, but because she understood very well the eyes that watched her, not just from others, but from the prejudice that had been lodged in her back since the day she stepped into the world. Passing the medical aisle, Malikika glanced for a box of Band-Aids. There was a small scratch on her hand, not deep, but long, caused by a panicked patient. There wasn't much blood, but the sting lingered. It wasn't a sharp pain, but it was there, persistent, like the weariness in her chest, something the body learns to ignore because it's not worth complaining about. As she bent down to the lower shelf, the light above flickered in a familiar rhythm. Someone had just entered the sensor zone. She looked up the entrance. Two men had just appeared, police uniforms. One was tall, with a busket and broad shoulders that pushed forward as if ready to shove anything in their path. The other was shorter, but his gaze was sharp as a scalpel, his neck stiff like a cold iron rod. Both moved slowly without speaking, but each step seemed to emphasize their presence, an unspoken declaration, "We're here and we see you." When their gaze stopped on her, Malika felt her spine tighten. It was a reflex, not from thought, but from genetics. She turned away, trying to keep her breathing steady. She hadn't done anything wrong. She wasn't stealing. She wasn't causing trouble. She was just buying milk and Band-Aids. But a voice rose in her head, not from the loudspeakers, not from the supermarket's background music, a warning deep from within. Instinct. She walked toward the checkout, her shopping cart held in front of her like a fragile barrier between her and the world. The cashier, a young girl clearly exhausted from her night shift, was typing away on the keyboard, tapping at it like she was tapping into nothingness, expecting nothing from tonight. The supermarket door slid open again. Malika didn't need to turn to know they were stepping further in. Their footsteps weren't rushed, but deliberate. The rhythm was calculated to avoid causing panic, but tight enough to take away every possible escape route. A security guard stood in the corner, eyes fixed on the monitor. He saw it all, but didn't move. He just flipped through a few pages of his shift notes as though nothing had happened. His body was trained to react to theft, but not programmed to intervene against prejudice. Malika lowered her head and opened her phone. The screen lit up. Jalen, his profile picture showed his happy smile from kindergarten graduation with a hat too big for his head, making his face seem even smaller. But his eyes shone as if looking toward an unlimited future. She bit her lip. She didn't want him to wake up and panic if he couldn't find her. She typed a line, "I'm in the supermarket, almost done." "You can sleep a bit more," she sent it, then put the phone back in her pocket. She turned back to the checkout counter, unaware that in just a few minutes, everything she thought was normal, harmless, and familiar would become something she would never forget. Not because it was big, but because it happened when she did. Nothing wrong. She was standing, choosing a carton of milk, when a voice suddenly cut through the air from behind. It wasn't loud, but sharp enough to send chills down her spine. Still leisurely shopping at a time like this, Malika turned around. The tall officer, eyes full of suspicion, stood with his arms crossed, as though he had just caught a thief in the act. He didn't introduce himself or state his reason for being there. He simply stood, sizing her up with the kind of gaze trained to view black people as the problem. "I just finished my shift," Malika responded, her voice calm but firm. "Nurse, right." He raised an eyebrow. "Seems fitting. White blouse, tired look. Oh, I heard nurses like you tend to pick up a little extra after hours." She tightened her grip on the basket. "I'm just here to buy milk for my son." He laughed, a mocking laugh. "Oh, and you have a son, huh? Left him in the car all alone at this hour?" She didn't respond, but her eyes briefly flickered as though every word he spoke was intentionally stripping away her dignity. "Where's your I'd." He took a step closer, his voice not loud, but clear. "Don't tell me you came in here with a shopping bag like this and no ID. Oh, wait, I'm not sure you have one." Malika looked at him, her gaze no longer avoiding his. "What are you checking me for?" He didn't answer immediately. He glanced at her hospital uniform, then at her skin color, and sneered. "Do you look like someone who can afford this stuff?" Malika stood there, her hand lightly resting on the handle of the shopping cart, her eyes fixed on Doyle. The air seemed to thicken as though a layer of fog had settled over everything. The white lights above casting harsh shadows, making every feature sharper, drier, devoid of humanity or reason. Doyle didn't seem in a rush. He looked at her with the gaze of someone who was too used to causing trouble, as though he was standing in front of a game he'd won 100 times. His mouth curved into a slight smirk, and his words came out dull and cutting. A white blouse doesn't make you a doctor. Your skin color is what raises suspicion. Malika didn't respond immediately. She didn't look away, but inside her chest, a wave of heat started to rise, not because his words were new, but because they were exactly what she'd heard, seen, and had to swallow countless times. This humiliation wasn't loud. It didn't need direct insults. It existed like smoke, suffocating but impossible to grab hold of. With bare hand, Riker stepped forward, pretending to adjust his radio on his shoulder, then suddenly reached out and lightly tapped Malika's left breast pocket. The action wasn't hard, wasn't painful, but it was possessive, a check no one had asked for, no one had allowed, and no one dared to speak out against. "Night shift nurse," Riker said in an even tone. "You look more like one of those girls in uniform, serving the rich men's pleasures." The words didn't come out like a joke. They were spoken with a flat, indifferent tone, cold enough to cut through all the defenses Malika had built over the years. She stood still, but her eyes began to change, not out of acceptance, but a form of restraint. Pressing down, building up, a woman with a shopping cart passed by. She saw everything, hesitated for a second, then turned away as if she hadn't seen anything or chose not to see. Malika glanced at the camera mounted on the ceiling of the supermarket. It was still recording, still lit, but what it was capturing might never be replayed. Or if it was, it would be cut, edited, and justified with endless legal jargon. "You're deliberately insulting me when I haven't violated anything," Makika said, her voice unnervingly calm. So calm it could only come from someone who had lived through storms without ever allowing herself to break, as though that control was the last weapon she had to protect her dignity before it was shredded by prejudice. Doyle laughed, a dry laugh that echoed through the cold supermarket space. There was no humor in it. It was the coldness of someone who knew they were allowed to offend and was taking full advantage of that privilege. "Your skin color is the first violation," he said. The words didn't need to be emphasized. No metaphor, no sarcasm, just a declaration, a blunt truth slipping from his lips as if the law was etched into his skin. In his world, the right to be present in public as a black woman wearing a white blouse holding a shopping cart, eyes straight ahead, was already wrong. No reason, no proof needed. The air felt suffocating for a moment. The lights along the aisles were still bright, but they did nothing to ease the tension. A middle-aged man at the end of the aisle stopped picking tomatoes and looked over at them. His eyes weren't exactly curious, but there was a hint of hesitation. However, just a few seconds later, he lowered his head and pushed his cart in the opposite direction, as if that glance was a mistake that needed to be corrected by distance. The silence of the people around them wasn't random. It was a choice, a way of survival, a compromise on the cost of intervention, and it made this humiliation even more bitter because no one was coming to her aid. Even though everyone saw it, Malika exhaled slowly. She couldn't react instinctively, not now. A single wrong blink, a quick breath, a voice raised above the usual level, anything could be labeled as aggressive, and she knew no one would stand by the side of a black woman seen as losing control in a supermarket at midnight. Every move now had to be calculated like a heart surgeon operating. Precise, steady, without emotion. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out her phone, not to record, not to threaten. She opened the contacts and pressed on the familiar name, Jalen. The name appeared on the screen like a lifeline. When her voice came through the call, it passed through a thin layer of glass, thin but blocking every crack. "I'm heading to the car now. Son, I'm close. Just go back to sleep." On the other end, Jalen's groggy voice came through. "Are you okay, Mom?" She swallowed hard. I'm fine. But she knew Jalen was used to hearing this fine. It wasn't an answer. It was the blanket covering something children shouldn't see. Doyle stood there watching her as she spoke. His eyes slid over her body, not observing, but invading. He looked at her as if she weren't a human, but a suspected counterfeit object. Then he smiled, not wide, but with a sneer, a cut at the corner of his lips, and from there, a phrase came out, each word clear. It's right that your son was born in fear, because his mother is the threat. Malikika gripped the phone tightly, her knuckles turned white, not from fear, but from restraint. That statement wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed directly at Jalen, a 6-year-old boy sleeping in the parking lot in the safety cocoon she tried to build each day with her shifts, sleepless nights, and unconditional reassurances. She had lied to her son to keep him from being afraid, that all police officers were good, that if he behaved, no one would harm him, but now in front of her was the vivid evidence good behavior wouldn't save anyone. A part of her wanted to scream, to tear apart the distance between reason and emotion. Another part of her wanted to cry, but she did nothing. She stood still, stood firm, as if a single movement would ignite the flames of hatred, catching everything she tried to protect. Doyle's gaze softened, but not from remorse. He thought he was winning. Riker remained silent, watching like a predator, waiting for its prey to make a move so it could justify the strike. A supermarket employee stepped up, standing a few meters away from them. He was young, small-framed, wearing a dark green uniform with the West End logo on the chest. He didn't dare come closer, just stood there, slightly hunched, eyes looking down at the ground, then glancing up briefly. In his gaze was something unclear, conscience or fear. But like everyone else, he chose not to be the first one to act. Malikika took a deep breath, slow, like someone preparing for the hardest surgery of her life. Then she slipped the phone back into her pocket. No words, no glance. But when she looked up, there was something different in her gaze. It was no longer a look of avoidance, no longer a look pleading for retreat. It was the look of someone waiting their turn, someone who knew they wouldn't win by force, but would survive by evidence. Doyle intended to say something more, but just then Riker slightly tilted his head. A very small eyebrow raised like an internal signal. They took a half step back, not retreating, but like hunters who had circled in on their prey, yet hadn't, struck because they sensed something was changing direction. Not fear, but calculation. Malikika didn't take her eyes off them. In that moment, the supermarket seemed still, yet it was shifting. Between the cold fluorescent lights, a silent struggle was happening, without a shout, a strike, or a fall. Just one sentence. It's right that your son was born in fear. And the silence that followed, not surrender, but an accusation. The air in the dairy aisle was thick, as if suffocated in a plastic bag with no escape. The cold smell of frozen foods mixed with the faint scent of metal from the shelves and floor, cleaner, making the space feel as stifling as an emergency room without oxygen. The clattering of shopping carts, the distant background music once filling the air now stopped, swallowed by an eerie silence. It was quiet enough for Malikika to hear her heart beat, each beat echoing in her chest like a knock against her ribs. Doyle had positioned himself at the front of the aisle, legs spread wide, posture like a predator blocking its prey. Riker stood to Malikika's left, leaning slightly forward, maintaining just enough distance to avoid any claims of physical intrusion, but close enough to make clear that she had nowhere to go. They didn't need bars, they didn't need chains. All they needed was eye contact and position. She had been cornered into an invisible triangle where the law was bent under the guise of routine checks. What had started as a check-in during patrol had now turned into a deliberate psychological siege. No shouting, no pushing, but sharp as a scalpel. Not cooperating, Riker spoke, his voice slower now, smooth and cold as medical steel. He took a step forward, the sound of his shoes striking the tile floor clearly cutting through the surrounding silence. Good, We're about to add resisting arrest to your charges." Malikika turned to look at him. There was no panic in her eyes, just a steady, unflinching gaze. Calm as a second skin, she had learned to grow for protection. But her palms had begun to sweat, moisture pooling at the base of her thumb. She knew the language they were speaking. No words, just power. The pressure built from their eyes, their voices, and the steps that were slowly closing in. She had heard these stories in the hospital rooms. Patients who had been dragged out of cars for no reason, handcuffed for walking at the wrong time, or interrogated for looking suspicious. Black people, young, old, men, women, all told the same stories she now faced. Eyes that weren't searching for the truth, but for weaknesses to exploit. She didn't react immediately. Her hand slid into her jacket pocket, her fingers brushing. The phone, a soft click echoed in the stillness. The recording had started. She didn't need to film, didn't need to shout. She only needed to capture the words, the pieces of systemic abuse. "Is this routine?" she asked, her voice small but taut like a boring. Each word as solid as an anchor in the storm. "Scoping out black women in the supermarket as part of your patrol." Doyle half smiled, his lips curling in a sneer. "We've seen a lot, but few dared to speak up." The words were light, but the weight of them pressed down like a stone. They didn't need to say this wasn't the first time. The way he said it was enough. This system had become accustomed to trampling, and anyone who resisted would be crushed. The same way, Malikika glanced down briefly, not to surrender, but to hide a small ironic smile. They weren't used to a black woman refusing to apologize. They were even less familiar with someone who didn't fit into the victim role society had assigned her from birth. Riker leaned in another half step. His voice was low, but clear enough to sink into her mind. "I'll make you wish you were white." For just one day, it wasn't an offhand insult. It was a bullet aimed straight at the root of Malikika's existence. The place where she had once been questioned in nursing school about special treatment, where patients had rejected her touch, just because they didn't feel safe. His words carried with them the entire history. The centuries of oppression passed down like an unspoken language. From the end of the aisle, a young man pushing a cart stopped. He didn't step in, just quietly pulled out his phone and started recording from a distance. Malikika didn't see, but Riker glanced in his direction. Doyle, however, didn't care. He was used to cameras, sometimes even liked them, like a hunter enjoying the presence of a witness. Malikika stood tall, the white lights above her illuminated every line of her cheekbones, every sweat bead that had gathered at her hairline. She didn't raise her head in pride. She stood firm like a marker, an unmovable presence. Her eyes no longer held defensiveness. They were a living testament. Riker pretended to bend down to the shopping cart. He flipped through a few items. Milk, a box of Band-Aids, and a few miscellaneous things. He chuckled softly. "You needed to come to the supermarket in the middle of the night for this. Don't you have a better shift to make money?" She thought of Jalan, the 8-year-old boy, dozing in the car, unaware that his mother was being treated like a stolen item. "Do you have children?" she asked, her voice steady and firm. "If you do, you'd understand that there are things you need to buy right away, like Band-Aids when a child's skin is torn. And if you have children, you'd know a mother has to get up and work every night, even when tired, because someone has to keep the light on so they can learn." Doyle didn't respond immediately. His face momentarily stiffened, not because of emotion, but because he couldn't find words sharp enough to deny her. Riker sneered, but his gaze dropped to Malikika's left hand. She still kept it in her jacket pocket, and he began to suspect something. His instincts were screaming some kind of danger, either a recording or evidence. From a distance, the young man filming moved a little closer. Malikika briefly caught his reflection in the freezer case. He didn't say anything, didn't gesture, but the camera was still recording. Doyle, perhaps realizing this, lowered his voice, almost whispering, "I know the type of person you are. Alert, stubborn, likes to argue, But let me tell you something. People like you, no matter how smart, can't change the reality. What reality? Malikika asked genuinely now. Doyle glanced at her, then smirked. That the system doesn't work based on right or wrong. It works based on who's more trustworthy. And at that moment, the atmosphere around them seemed to deflate. There were no more threats, no more theatrics, just a raw confession that they knew exactly what they were doing, that they might be wrong, but they would still win because they wore the uniform and were trusted. Riker had not yet laid a hand on her, but his gaze had shifted. No longer a joke, nor the usual smug sneer. His eyes now reflected the tone of a man who had decided that if he couldn't silence her with logic, he would do so with humiliation. Doyle remained motionless. He stood like a statue, arms crossed as if Malikika were not a woman coming off her shift, but an object that needed to be turned over and inspected. Malikika stayed in place, slightly bending her back to keep her left hand still in her coat pocket. The recorder was still running. She wasn't sure if it could be used as evidence, but at least it was capturing the truth. Each heavy breath, every long pause, every venomous word that came from their mouth. A shopping cart at the end of the aisle lightly bumped against the metal shelf before quickly being pulled back. The man pushing it, a middle-aged man, quietly turned his cart in the opposite direction. No one wanted to get involved in what was happening here. The whole supermarket seemed to hold its breath. People didn't need to hear the full story to know that this wasn't a safe place for anyone with dark skin to argue. "I'll check again." Riker's voice now sounded like a razor scraping across metal. Steady, sharp, and purposefully enunciated. Without warning, he reached out, thrusting his hand directly into Malikika's right coat pocket. No permission asked, no explanation given. His hand was cold and rough as it brushed against her chest under the white blouse, pawing at the phone like a predator, feeling its prey before the strike. Malikika took a half step back, but there was no time. She bumped into the shelf behind her. Boxes of milk rolled off, one hitting her ankle. But Malikika didn't bend down. Her left hand stayed in the pocket. Now she knew that just one wrong move, just pushing his hand away a bit too forcefully, would give them the excuse to call irresistant. "I don't agree to this. I haven't been informed of my rights for a civil check." Her voice was dry but firm. No hostility, no raised tone, but as clear as a needle piercing flesh. Doyle laughed. His voice scraped like rusted metal against concrete. "Who do you think you are? This isn't a TV show where you read the law to us. This is real life. And in real life, people don't stop just because you say no." Malikika felt the coldness creep up her back. Not from the air conditioning, but from the rawness of his words. It wasn't a threat, it was a message. Riker moved closer, his breath so near that Malikika could smell the stale cigarette smoke mixed with the foul odor of power that had been allowed to abuse. "Are you recording this?" he asked, his voice never lowering. Malikika didn't answer. She only looked him directly in the eye, not avoiding it, not challenging him, just the look of someone bearing witness, living, and recording. And it was this that began to make those who had always seen others as beasts grow angry, because nothing irritates them more than someone who isn't crushed when they want it to happen. Riker slammed his hand down on the shopping cart. A dry, sharp sound echoed through the frozen dairy aisle. A supermarket employee glanced over, then immediately turned away. Silence fell once again like a curtain of complicity. The whole aisle seemed to mute itself, allowing the invasion to take place. In the gray area of law and morality, from a distance, a small click was heard, the sound of a phone camera. Someone had recorded it stealthily but clearly. No one spoke, but Malika felt the presence of a fourth person. A lens was watching, whether it was salvation or the evidence of tragedy. She couldn't tell. She stood up from her defensive stance and adjusted her posture. She brushed a band-aid that had fallen from her leg, not looking into anyone's eyes anymore. Now she understood clearly that no argument would win. Her presence, a black woman wearing a blouse, not bowing her head, was the thorn they were trying to remove. Doyle circled behind her. His breath was so close to her neck it made her skin crawl. A pause and then a whisper, slick and venomous like oil spreading. Do you know what we hate the most? It's the way you all pretend to be noble, as if educated. Black people are an exception to be prioritized. Malikika heard it and she understood. They didn't hate her for her action. They hated that her presence didn't match the script they had written. That black women should be afraid, should be quiet, should step back. They didn't know how to handle someone like her, so they would do whatever it took to push her back into the role. At that moment, from the left side of the aisle, a breathless voice called out, "Mom, Jalen." She turned around. Her body froze for a moment, not because she saw him, but because he had seen everything. The 9-year-old boy, thin, wearing a dark green hoodie, his face twisted with worrying. He ran toward her, gasping for breath. "Go back to the car, Jalen." Malikika's voice was low but firm. Doyle turned to her. "Is this your child?" Jalen nodded, still not fully understanding, but sensing the gravity of the situation, he said, as if to protect his mother, "Mom's buying milk. She didn't do anything wrong." And for the first time, the two officers were silent. Not because they felt ashamed, but because suddenly there was a young witness, and the law, though it could be bent, couldn't easily ignore a child standing in the face of truth. Malikika stepped forward, placing her hand on her son's shoulder. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it was like the last anchor holding her steady. "Go to the car," she whispered. "I'll be out in a minute." Jalen looked at her, his eyes moist, then stepped back. But he still looked over his shoulder as if he couldn't believe his mother, the one who had taught him to keep promises, to share, to never do wrong, was being surrounded like a thief in the dairy aisle. Riker watched the boy, then turned back, throwing out a cold, sharp remark. "You just scared your son." Malikika didn't hesitate. She replied, clear and calm as if writing a prescription. "No, you did." No one responded because they couldn't. Because at that moment, nothing could hide the truth. A black mother standing tall in the harsh white light of the supermarket had to teach her child, not from books, not from words, but through her very presence, that injustice was real, and sometimes standing still was an act. And in the final silence, the hum of the air conditioning continued. The recorder in her pocket kept running, and behind her, somewhere in the camera, history repeated itself. The only thing that changed was the face, but the fear remained unchanged. Jalen had just turned, his small figure fading behind the glass doors of the supermarket, his gaze still full of confusion as he looked back. Malikika didn't dare follow him with her eyes. She knew that if she looked, if even a second of weakness slipped through, everything would collapse. She couldn't let her son see his mother distorted into the image she had fought her whole life to avoid. A black woman kneeling before a white cop. Not tonight, not when all she was trying to do was buy milk for her son. Doyle cleared his throat and stepped forward like someone who had just cleared the path to assert their power. "Your son's a good kid. Are you sure? Do you want him growing up seeing this?" Malikika didn't answer. She stared straight ahead. Her eyes didn't waver, but they blurred from the lingering pain in her shoulder, an ache from Riker's hard tug. But physical pain was nothing compared to the growing ache in her chest, the feeling of having her dignity stripped away under the supermarket lights, under the silent camera lenses, just like everyone else around her. Riker took a step back, his gaze scrutinizing as if searching for the softest place to twist her body. There was no reason left. Now it was just a power game. "What kind of look is that?" Doyle growled, tilting his head slightly, narrowing his eyes. "That look in another place would be reason enough to get shot." Malikika didn't blink. She only quietly said, "I'm looking at your conscience, but it seems useless." Doyle laughed. A short, contemptuous, unnecessary laugh. He shook his head and spoke loudly as if giving a lecture. The only thing that makes you suspicious is how you dare talk to us like a normal person. Riker didn't say anything. He didn't need words to assert the power he believed he had. He acted instead, without warning, like an electric shock. He grabbed Malaka's left wrist, twisting it behind her with such force that her shoulder was wrenched to the side. The small snap of her joints echoed, a tiny sound that made the pain shoot down her spine. Malika leaned forward, one hand gripping the shelf to steady herself. She didn't scream. She didn't groan. She clenched her teeth, her lips tight, her eyes wide open, as if the pain was the only thing keeping her conscious at that moment. She knew too well if she let out a sound, they would use that to label her uncooperative. A perfect excuse to write in their report. Subject was agitated, had to be restrained. "Let go," she said, her words barely audible, as if the wind whispered through her clenched teeth. But people like Riker didn't need words. He switched hands and slipped behind her. Then the jerk happened. Malika's curly hair, tied neatly at the back of her head, was yanked violently, pulled back like a leash. Her head snapped back, her neck screamed in pain, and her vision shattered with the bright glow of fluorescent lights directly in her eye. For a split second, the world turned cold white. She collapsed. The impact of her head against the edge of the shopping cart made a sound like metal striking iron. Her cheek slammed hard against the floor. Her lips split open, the taste of blood shot straight to the back of her throat, mixing with the dust, and the feeling of no longer being human. But she didn't scream. The pain was now overshadowed by something greater. Humiliation. Not just personal humiliation, but the kind imposed on her by a whole system like an invisible label. The one who needs to be corrected. Doyle stood nearby, offering no intervention. He even bent down, bringing his face close to her ear, his voice cold as ice. Now this is the right image, a black woman lying exactly where she belongs. Malika didn't blink. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, mixing with sweat and dust from the floor on her cheek. She couldn't speak. Her throat constricted, but her gaze didn't falter. Her eyes stared at Doyle as if trying to engrave his face in her memory, to never forget, never forgive. A click echoed. Someone took a photo. From a distance behind the shelves, a supermarket employee briefly appeared, then quickly disappeared into the shadows as if they had never existed. No one stepped forward. Riker exhaled sharply, stood up. "You should thank me for not handcuffing you right there on the floor." Malika pushed herself up, her lips turning purple, blood dripping down her blouse, now wrinkled from the struggle, but she didn't respond. She stood up, not in a hurry, not forcefully, but every movement of hers was a statement. She was still. Here, she hadn't fallen. "You think you're teaching me a lesson," she said, her breath shallow. "But the only lesson you're teaching is that when power is out of control, it behaves like an animal." Doyle flinched slightly. Riker moved forward, about to grab her again, but Malika managed to step back. She pulled her hand away from him. Then, in a motion opposite to the chaos that had just occurred, she calmly adjusted her disheveled hair. As her hand brushed past her right ear, a small skin-colored device appeared, wireless earbuds. She didn't need to yell. She whispered just loud enough for both of them to hear. "I'm not alone. I'm not just recording. I'm streaming live and someone is listening right now." The atmosphere in the supermarket seemed to freeze. Riker took a step back. Doyle looked around, then up at the cameras. The sound system, his eyes, began to waver. It was as if the power, his armor, was peeling away in the face of a truth he couldn't control. Riker continued, "The video won't be lost. The sound won't be cut, and you've just let the entire country know. This is how the police treat a black mother buying milk at midnight." The cashier's counter door swung open. An employee shouted, "Who filmed that? Send it to me." A customer yelled back, "I have it. I've been recording since the start." Another person held up their phone to live stream, then another. Malika didn't need to say anything more. No one did. She had broken the invisible glass of fear. No one bowed their head anymore. No one turned away. Riker and Doyle stood still, silent, but their gaze, their once cold and arrogant gaze, was now left with only one thing: fear. Malikika took a step back, then another, not to escape, but to see them more clearly in the light, amid the crowd, amid the sound of phones clicking and people beginning to speak up. This time, she knew they couldn't touch her anymore. Not when the whole world was starting to truly look. Some people believe that all the worst things happen in the dark, but for Malikika, the dark was the least frightening thing. What truly makes a person crumble is the light, the cold, sterile white light of the West End supermarket ceiling shining down on where she collapsed. In that light, there is no room for illusions. There's nowhere to hide. She heard disheveled hair, blooded lips, and the last trace of dignity in her eyes was exposed like an object, not a person. But things began to change when the first click of a camera echoed. Then came the second, followed by more phones being raised. And as the stare shifted from indifference to silence, then from silence to anger, Malikika knew something had just moved beyond the control of those in uniform. Not far from her, Miguel, a sophomore student working part-time, had been standing behind the toilet paper aisle for more than 7 minutes. His hands were shaking as he held his phone. Every instinct told him to put it away, that he would get fired, that this was someone else's problem. But he stayed there. He kept recording because for the first time in his life, he couldn't pretend he didn't see it. He uploaded the video to his secondary TikTok account, which he had created just to post random videos like lip-syncing or cats yawning in the morning. He never thought this account would be the one to spark a media firestorm. Just 8 minutes after the video was posted, it had 5,000 views. 3 minutes later, 20,000, then 60,000, then 100,000, and it was still climbing uncontrollably. In the comments section, lines poured out, breaking the silence that had hardened over the years. Is this America in 2025? She's being dragged by her hair in a supermarket. Does anyone know where this store is? I'll block the door. The one filming is a hero, and she's the reason we need to stand up. Miguel stood there, still holding his phone, his eyes glued to the screen as if the wave would stop if he left. But he didn't know. The wave had already left shore. It had become a storm. There was no turning back. Meanwhile, Malikika sat leaning against the cold wall at the far end of the frozen aisle. A supermarket worker, pale-faced, handed her a bottle of water with shaking hands. She didn't drink. She still had her phone in her pocket. A small earpiece snugged against her left ear. The device transmitting steady signals like an invisible wire connecting her to the outside where the truth was being witnessed in real time. Riker stood a few steps away, his gaze disordered. Doyle still didn't fully understand what was happening, but he started to sense something unmistakable. The eyes in the supermarket were no longer avoiding her. They were watching, not shouting, not yelling, but watching, and it was that silence, intentional and decisive, that unsettled him more than any verbal opposition. What's that with the earpiece? Doyle snapped, stepping forward, pointing at her ear. Malikika didn't answer. She simply took off the earpiece, raised it for a brief second for everyone to see, and then put it back in her pocket. No words, no need for an explanation. A woman's voice rang out from the end of the aisle. I saw the video. Every second, everyone here did. It was a middle-aged woman, her coat draped over her shoulder, still holding the phone, live-streaming the event. Doyle turned to face her. He took a step back. Murmurs began. First just a few whispers, then spreading like smoke leaking in a closed room. Someone spoke up. She's a doctor. A doctor at the National Hospital, Dr. Malikika Darnell. Phones were pulled out at once. Her name was searched, and in a matter of seconds, the results appeared. An article about the front-line doctor. During the pandemic, a single mother who had saved over 30 newborns in a staffing crisis. Real images, real achievements. A real person, Not a threat. Not a suspect. Riker turned pale. He wanted to say something, but his throat tightened. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Doyle's phone buzzed, too. They pulled them out and read a brief message from their superior. Immediate suspension. Return to the station. Internal investigation is on its way. No one shouted. No one gave orders, but they both knew they had been exposed. Not just filmed, but revealed, stripped bare in front of the crowd. The evidence was no longer on paper. It was alive. It was moving. It was spreading by the second, and it couldn't be erased. A few blocks away in a quiet apartment, Mayor Elijah Darnell, Malikika's father, was jolted awake by a midnight emergency call from the communications director. He sat up, opened his computer. The screen displayed an image of his daughter, her lip torn, blood seeping through her blouse, her eyes still unbowed. He didn't blink. He spoke decisively into the phone. Call internal affairs and get a car to pick up Malik. On the other end, the voice asked, "What about the two officers?" He replied, his voice cold as the night mist, "Take them back to the station immediately. I don't need to wait for a report. I have eyes. I have ears." His hand clenched into a fist. Not like a politician making a decision, but like a father trying to hold back the anger that was about to drown him. In his eyes was the image of little Malikika asking him for the first time, "Dad, why does my skin make people hate me?" He had told her, "You have to be strong because the color of your skin will make the world test you twice as hard." But now he understood. The world didn't just test the world tortures. And this time he wouldn't let it happen without consequence. Alika was helped to a chair, but she refused pity. She demanded to go outside to get her son. Jalen was still sitting in the car. When he saw his mother walking out, he slammed the door open and ran to her. The boy hugged her tightly, not asking a word, just crying uncontrollably. "I'm fine," she whispered. "I'm still standing. Do you see?" Someone filmed that moment, and this time, no one looked away. From the moment the video reached 1 million views, the definition of Malikika Darnell was no longer confined to the blurry frame of a black woman being humiliated in the West End supermarket. She was no longer just a victim. She became the embodiment of something greater, a symbol, as the media called it. But for those who had remained silent when witnessing injustice, she was a mirror that could no longer be avoided. Her calm stance after the fall, her eyes locked into the camera, and her voice unapologetic for existing in this world with her skin color were what made the video spread without any campaign. And when her real name surfaced, not through justification, but via official records, old articles, and medical images, the true media earthquake began. By 10 a.m., millions of people across the United States woke up to the same clip. Single black mom dragged by police. Then they realized who she is. Those who had seen it couldn't look away. Those who hadn't been repeatedly sent messages. "You need to see this." An urgent NBC News report began with footage of Malikika being pushed to the ground in the supermarket aisle. Blood on her lips, white light reflecting off the floor. The anchor struggled to hide his emotion as he read her bio. An award-winning nurse during the pandemic, a single mother raising her child since her husband, a firefighter, had passed away. She had spoken at a memorial for COVID-19 victims. She had held abandoned infants in the emergency room, cradling them in a room thick with the smoke of breath. And last night, she was dragged from the checkout aisle to the floor like a criminal. Caught in the act, at the same time, in the city hall, Mayor Elijah Darnell walked into an emergency meeting room with red eyes. He didn't speak immediately, only opened his laptop and played the video. The room, usually filled with political debates, was now as silent as a church at midnight. From the first second to the last, no one interrupted. They saw Doyle smirk when calling Malikika a threat because of her skin color, so Riker leaned in, close to whisper insults, saw her hand tremble, but her eyes did not shed a tear. When the screen turned off, Elijah didn't need to speak for long. He looked at each person in the room, his gaze no longer that of a mayor reading a report. It was the gaze of a father who had just watched his daughter be dragged to the depths of a system he once believed could be fixed from the inside. Then he slammed his words down slow and sure like nails on the table. Last night it was my daughter, but today if we don't act, tomorrow will be your children. No one in the room dared to look him in the eye. They had heard him speak many times, seen him shift policies, and watched him stand firm under national political pressure. But this was the first time they saw him speak like a man whose blood was boiling in his veins, not the language of a politician, but of a man who had once believed in justice and was betrayed right in the middle of a supermarket. A communications advisor, a lawyer with many years of media experience, hesitated before speaking. His voice faltered. Should we hide that Malikika is your biological daughter? It might weaken the message. It could be seen as using family for politics. The room held its breath, but Elijah didn't hesitate, not for a second. No ifs. Everyone already knows, and I won't deny my blood to keep a seat. His voice rang out, not loud, but as strong as the beating of a drum. Immediately, he pulled a pen from his suit pocket and signed the suspension of the 2 officers involved. He didn't wait for them to speak, didn't call a staff meeting. No calculations. He had already made his choice. Justice before politics. 2 hours later, a press conference was held urgently, but social media had already outpaced the government. The hashtag Justice for Malikika claimed the #1 spot nationwide within 5 hours. This hashtag was not just a banner, but a wake-up call. Posts appeared thick as the first snow. Single mothers posted photos with their children in supermarkets under fluorescent lights just like the moment Malikika was surrounded. Black doctors shared their stories of being blocked at hospital entrances because they didn't look like doctors. An award-winning nurse, her experience of being asked to prove why she was in a high-end neighborhood. Malikika's story turned out not to be an exception. It was a mirror reflecting thousands of shadows looking down. A group of medical students organized an online forum with the topic, why were they suspicious of Malikika? Not because they didn't see her qualifications, but because they saw her skin color. That question spread across forums, TV, and podcasts, a direct wave, no longer metaphorical. The next morning, a group of nurses walked into the West End supermarket, wearing crisp white blouses, silently lining up between the aisles. Each person held a photo of Malika, no banners, no calls for action, just their eyes, determined, direct, and burning like a fire no one could extinguish. They didn't speak, but their presence was louder than any speech. In a quiet hospital room, Malikika sat by Jalen's bed. Light filtered through the curtain, soft and dim. Jalen was dozing after a long coughing fit. His face still carried the look of confusion. When he woke, the first thing he asked wasn't about breakfast, but Mom, are you okay? Malikika smiled, a shaky smile, but gentle, like a wound just starting to heal. I'm fine. I'm still standing. Do you see? Jalen didn't respond. He just nodded, then reached out to hold her hand. The grip wasn't strong, but in it was everything a child couldn't name. Worrying, love, and a new fear of the world outside the car window. A nurse walked in, gently handing Malikika the ringing phone. On the screen, one name appeared, Elijah. She took the phone, lifted it to her ear. She didn't say anything. On the other end, his voice came through, not as the mayor, not as the man who signed an emergency order, just as a father. Daughter. Malikika took a long breath as if needing more air to keep from crying. Her voice was low, slow, as if for the first time she revealed her vulnerability. Not meant for the press. Dad. Then she paused, stepped back for a moment, and corrected herself. No, Elijah, she continued clearly without hesitation. I don't need this call because I'm your daughter. I need it because there are thousands of women like me out there who don't have anyone to call. the line fell silent. And in that moment, the mayor of a city with 10 million people was no longer a politician. He wasn't thinking about his term or his approval ratings. He only saw one thing. In that brief moment between father and daughter, what he had always believed in, truth, not strategy. When night fell on the city that evening, the lights still flickered brightly everywhere, but it seemed as if all the light was pointed to one place, West End, not the billboard lights, not the street lights, but the light from phone screens, from millions of eyes that had once looked away, now staring, unblinking. It was the light from those who had remained silent, now finding their voices, from the late apologies of those who had stood by indifferently, from families who, for the first time, told their children, "This is injustice and we won't accept it." And in the center of that circle of light stood Malikika, the mother, once touched without permission, shoved toward the milk aisle like a thief, now standing, not needing anyone's permission, not needing to prove who was right or wrong. As long as she stood, everything was not over. By the time the sun rose on the third morning, no one in the West End supermarket's management expected that the doors, which usually opened without incident, would become the focal point of an unprecedented wave of protest. The welcome sign hung high was no longer an invitation, but had turned into a reverse question. Who is truly welcomed in this space? The checkout counter still lit up, still operated. But everything moved unusually slowly, not due to a staff shortage, but because customers, the ones who once breezed past the counters without a glance, now stopped. They raised their phones, panning over the ceiling, the cameras on the walls, the security guards behind the glass, as if these were pieces of evidence in a case being recreated. No one was just shopping anymore. Every look, every step, every photo being taken carried a message: "We are watching you." More importantly, they were questioning why no one had spoken up, why a woman in a white blouse, a nurse, a mother could be interrogated like a criminal right in the space that was supposed to be safe. Initially, West End's management chose the most classic approach: silence. A nameless spokesperson replied to a press email with a brief hollow paragraph that seemed like a pre-written template. "We are cooperating with the authorities to clarify the situation." No admission, no commitment, no emotion. But what they didn't know was that silence was no longer the safe option in the age of smartphones, always ready to record. The more they remained silent, the greater the fury grew on social media. The video of Malikika being cornered by two police officers spread like wildfire. People started dissecting each frame. In it, the supermarket security guard was visible. He stood there, phone in hand, looking over, then turning his head away. No action, no words of intervention, a headshake, refusing responsibility. At a press conference a few days later, a black reporter stood up, her voice firm. "Why didn't any of the staff step in? Why is there no internal protocol to protect customers from abuse of power?" The head of security for the brand, neatly combed hair, white shirt, stammered in response. "We've trained staff according to the proper safety procedures." The words only added fuel to the fire. The room erupted in dry laughter, suppressed coughs, and flashing camera lights. On social media, a wave of articles analyzing the failure of the procedure began spreading. If the procedure teaches people to turn away when faced with injustice, then the procedure itself is wrong. The pressure from the community wasn't only coming from social media. Civil society organizations quickly got involved. A coalition of black women's groups, human rights law firms, statewide nursing associations, and even student activist groups issued a joint statement. If West End did not fire the security staff member who ignored Malikika, they would call for a nationwide boycott. Not stopping there, a group of law students from the local university set up tents in front of the main supermarket, hanging bright red banners. "If the camera doesn't protect the vulnerable, then the camera is complicit." These words quickly spread. They were printed on t-shirts, on stickers, and projected onto city center buildings with public projectors. Westend was no longer just the name of a chain of stores. It had become a symbol of indifference, of looking away in the face of injustice, of a society programmed to turn a blind eye. Within the supermarket's leadership, divisions began to form. One group of senior leaders believed the storm would pass if they kept silent and let things be, but another group, including younger executives and notably major investors, began to panic. Financial analysis reports raised red flags: declining customer traffic, increasing negative shares, and a sharp drop in brand loyalty among female customers, especially black women, who made up a significant portion of the shopping demographic. The stock of the parent company began to decline slightly. Although it wasn't yet at the level of panic, it was enough for financial advisors to sound the alarm. Then came the biggest blow, not from social media, but from the trade room. One of the largest dairy companies announced it was ending its exclusive distribution contract with Westend, declaring that it could not collaborate with an organization that disregards human rights. The news hit like a bomb, and a ripple effect began. Mueller suppliers quietly but decisively pulled out. Meanwhile, rival supermarket chains immediately launched advertising campaigns with slogans like "Respect Nurses," "Support Single Mothers," offering discounts and free tote bags with the words, "Every mother deserves protection." Customers flocked to the competitor chains as a form of support. Westend was pushed to the sidelines of the market it had once dominated like an empire. On Thursday morning, the supermarket leadership held an urgent meeting. The atmosphere was tense, with no reassurances that things would calm down as usual. The communications director said, "If we don't act now, we'll lose more than customers. We'll lose the image we've built over 20 years. The HR director suggested making a direct statement, naming Malikika and the wrongdoings. The next day, the CEO, exhausted from sleepless nights, appeared before the cameras and said, "We failed to protect a mother, a healthcare worker, and a human being." Behind him, the board stood with heads bowed, acknowledging that they could no longer avoid the truth. His words were firm. "We are firing all involved security personnel, restructuring the surveillance system, and offering a public apology to Ms. Malikika Darnell." The apology wasn't a noble act, it was the minimum to survive, but it mattered that they named her. Malikika watched the press conference in the nurses' lounge, muting the TV after hearing her name. She knew it wasn't justice yet, but they couldn't bury her story anymore. A small crack of light was enough to pierce the darkness. This time, it was big enough. Those who had turned away when she was humiliated in the aisle could no longer avoid the truth. The supermarket chain changed. A community began to listen. And a country, though still unjust, was no longer silent. Malikika, who had only gone to buy milk for her son, had awakened the city from its apathy. She didn't need applause or recognition. For those who have endured for so long, justice comes not from an apology, but from the moment when everyone is forced to see and cannot look away. The news was no longer in the hands of faceless accounts or hastily edited videos. For the first time since the incident, national TV channels broadcast the story with headlines that didn't shy away, didn't blur the truth, and didn't distort identities. CNN ran the headline in read, "Black nurse humiliated by police. Mayor's daughter becomes symbol of resistance." MSNBC dedicated an entire section, "Malika Darnell, from supermarket aisle to the heart of justice." The hosts no longer kept their usual safe distance. Their voices carried restrained anger, quiet disappointment, and a sense of shame for having ignored similar stories before simply because the victims didn't have enough status. Meanwhile, evening entertainment programs began shifting gears. A popular talk show aired the footage of Malikika being dragged by her hair, then froze the frame at the moment she lifted her head, her gaze calm, lips slightly pursed as if waiting for the world to see what she would do next. The audience didn't laugh. They didn't shout. They stood in silence. Then the host, a white man previously criticized for his political correctness, looked directly into the camera and said, "That's the look that makes me feel ashamed because I've never had to go buy milk thinking I might be dragged down. It wasn't just television." Print newspapers also devoted their front pages to Malikika. The New York Times published a full-page photo of Malikika in her white blouse, blood-staining, her lips, standing between the rows of shelves with two police officers behind her. The large caption below read, "She didn't scream, but the whole country heard." The Washington Post went further. They launched a series of investigative pieces tracing similar incidents over the past 5 years in supermarkets across America, places where black women were treated as suspects simply for their appearance, language, or, in the case of Malikika, for being alone, shopping at night, and everywhere it was the same. No camera footage had ever been publicly released. No witness had ever stepped forward. And no apologies had ever been given until Malikika forced them to face themselves. Beyond mainstream media, independent social media channels also got involved. An investigative team on YouTube leaked an internal recording from the police station where Doyle and Riker work. In the audio, a male voice believed to be their superior speaks indifferently. What trouble? Her skin color causes trouble. First, the recording spread in under an hour, and under public pressure, the police department was forced to verify the authenticity. They confirmed the voice was that of a sergeant on duty who was immediately suspended. A young reporter named Aaliyah Chen from an independent paper specializing in civil rights violations went to the hospital where Malikika was recovering. She didn't try to sneak in, didn't wear press credentials, and didn't demand an exclusive interview. Aaliyah simply walked down the hallway, asked a nurse on duty, and then quietly left a handwritten note at the door. It read, "If you want someone to tell the right story, I'm here." Malikika read that note one dull afternoon. Jalan was sleeping beside her, his cough still rattling like an old machine that refused to stop. The room had only the faint light from a small window and the steady drip of the form machine like the weak breath of a society struggling to survive after its punch. She didn't call back, not immediately, but she held the note for a long time, folded it carefully, and tucked it under her son's pillow where she kept things she didn't want anyone to take. By the end of the week, nearly everyone in the city knew the name Malikika Darnell. She was no longer just a figure in a video. She was no longer just a name under a hashtag. She had become unwillingly a symbol of something everyone knew, but no one dared to name. People who had scrolled past the video with a furrowed brow now came back to share it with the caption, "I've been silent for too long." The spread was no longer about the number of shares, but about the awareness that they too had looked the other way, and that in some way, that silence had been the last piece of the puzzle that allowed the event to unfold. Reporters who had initially thought of this as just another incident began writing differently, not because they changed political direction, but because they realized that thinking of it as just another incident was the problem. The habit of viewing violence, a trivial event, was proof that we had become so accustomed to inhumanity that we no longer recognized it. A small local newspaper once bought out by a large media conglomerate published a public apology. No flowery words, no long explanations, just a headline, "We were there and we stayed silent." That article was shared hundreds of thousands of times. Not because the paper was important, but because for the first time, people saw someone in the system daring to write, "We were wrong." At West End Supermarket, where it all began, the press camped out day and night. No longer just hot news, but a destination. Every photo taken of the glass doors, every video of the checkout counters became material, not just for news, but for history. A young cashier who had only been working for 2 months stood in front of the camera with a pale face. She didn't cry, but her voice trembled like wind slipping through a crack in the door. "I saw them do that to her and I did nothing. I thought about my mom and I felt so small." No one blamed her. But that statement was quoted hundreds of times. It appeared in podcasts, opinion articles, and even in media classes, a testament to the price paid for choosing silence, the brutality of witnessing, and the bitterness of doing nothing. On a local radio station, a late-night program invited listeners to call in and share. The phone lines were constantly blocked. An elderly man, his voice from smoking, spoke slowly. "I used to be a cub. I thought I understood the law. But what I saw wasn't law enforcement. It was hunting." The host choked on his words. It took him a few seconds to say, "Maybe we all need to relearn the concept of justice." The show, which usually served a small town, that night reached over 2 million listeners through the app, and most of them were not involved. They were people who had once thought, "This doesn't concern me," but now they knew it was all connected, because no one lives outside the system, and if the system is wrong, then silence is wrong, too. No newsroom, no TV station, and no social media platform could say, "We didn't know." The truth had been exposed, and once the light had shone, the dark corners could no longer pretend to be invisible. Malikika did not give interviews. She did not appear in front of the cameras. She didn't need to. She simply existed, still wearing her white blouse every day, still going to work, still caring for patients as before. But now every step she took in the hospital corridor was a silent declaration. Without words, "I'm still here." The media, after years of telling the stories of the powerful for the first time, returned to its true role to be a witness for justice. Not a megaphone for information, but a responsible observer, a keeper of memory. Each article, each podcast segment, each minute of television, each late-night radio call, all became bricks laid down for what society had lacked most, a truth that wouldn't be forgotten. But the most important thing wasn't in the media. It wasn't in the viewership numbers or reach. The most important thing was that millions of people looked at Malikika and saw themselves, and when they saw themselves, they knew, if yesterday it was her, today it could be anyone. They had once remained silent. Now it was time to speak. Not for her, but for themselves. The phone in the mayor's office rang at 4:12 a.m. It wasn't the time for a routine call. But Marcus, the night assistant, a young man trained never to miss any urgent contact, glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number with no name. After a brief hesitation, he picked up the phone. On the other end, there was only heavy breathing at first, followed by a voice so soft that he had to lean in to hear. Tell him they did this right in front of my son. I'm Marcus froze. Sorry, who was calling? Malikika Darnell. Her voice wasn't loud, wasn't shaking, but dry, as if each syllable had passed through physical pain. I'm not calling for special treatment. I'm calling to remind him of his promise. That sentence made Marcus stand up from his chair. He knew her name, not because she was an acquaintance, but because just hours earlier, the communications team had repeatedly mentioned her name in the emergency meeting. Her name had been repeated in reports, tweets, and videos. He didn't respond immediately, only said tersely, "I'll wake him up." While holding the phone, he turned and ran into the bedroom, where Mayor Jeremy Darnell was resting. When Marcus opened the door, Jeremy had already sat up. There were no signs of being startled or angry. His eyes were wide open, alert, as if he had predicted everything that was about to happen. Marcus only said one sentence, "It's her." He didn't ask who. He knew. The phone was quickly handed to Jeremy. He pressed the receiver to his ear, his other hand tightly holding the bracelet his daughter had made for him in kindergarten. A beaded chain with the words "I Hero" engraved on it. He didn't say hello. He didn't say, "I'm listening." He just exhaled softly and waited. "I don't need anyone to speak for me," Malikika said. "But if power was ever meant to protect, then now it's time to prove it." There was a long silence between them, not one of awkwardness, but of two people once so close that they didn't need words to understand the pain the other was enduring. And now the distance of the years without contact was shattered in an instant. "I've seen it," Jeremy replied, his voice so low that he could barely hear himself. Every frame, every word. "I didn't think this would happen to you. It didn't happen to me," she corrected. "It happened to us, to everyone who thought that just living decently would be enough for safety." That was when Jeremy was no longer the mayor, no longer a man in a suit holding power. He was a father who had once let go of his daughter to let her walk her path, and now realized that path had led her to the edge of public outrage. Within 30 minutes of that call, the entire mayor's office switched to emergency mode. No sirens, no fanfare, but all departments were immediately activated. The legal department was instructed to gather all complaints related to Officers Doyle and Riker from the past 4 years. The communications department was tasked with preparing responses for every possible outcome from dismissal to prosecution, and most importantly, a strategic advisory team was summoned to assess the entire structure of the city police department, an entity long protected by an administrative system as tangled as ivy around the gates of justice. Meanwhile, Malikika sat in her hospital room watching her son sleep. She didn't know what that call would change. She didn't believe in the power of authority anymore. But she believed that sometimes the past would come to collect its debts, and Jeremy, no matter who he was now, had once been the law student who swore to never let anyone lose their voice in a system that shuts its ears. News of the mayor's direct contact with the victim caused a massive public outcry. Some were skeptical, claiming this was just the government chasing public opinion, but most began to scrutinize the relationship between Jeremy and Malikika. Old college photos resurfaced of them in the debate club arguing the Constitution, holding hands in front of the police station after a protest, and then no one saw them together again. The media flocked to dig up the past, but Malikika remained silent. She didn't need the past to be weaponized. She just wanted the present truth to be seen. That afternoon, the mayor called a private press conference. It wasn't like any press conference that had ever taken place in City Hall. There were no flags, no advisors behind him. He stood alone before a microphone with the lights shining directly on his face, which had gone through a sleepless night. He didn't read from a prepared statement. He looked directly into the camera and said, "When I chose the political path, I always believed that there were people who needed representation, but sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who suffer because we haven't done enough." He paused, gripped the podium with both hands, and continued. "Malikika Darnell is someone I once cherished. She doesn't need me to protect her. She needs me to clean up a system that let her be treated like a criminal simply because of the color of her skin and the blouse she wore." That statement was broadcast live nationwide. It became a milestone that many would refer to later as the moment a true leader admitted fault, not because of fear of public opinion, but because he realized the wound had gone too deep to pretend it didn't exist. That evening, Malikika still didn't answer the phone from any reporters. She lay still, eyes closed, quietly listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor. She knew that some things had just begun, and she also knew that the only thing she needed to do now was to survive strong enough to witness the change happening. She didn't need a miracle. She just needed them to stop pretending. And that evening, the whole city stopped pretending. The next morning, no one at City Hall was allowed to leave their desk. The order came directly from the mayor's office, encrypted, under an emergency notification with the phrase understood by the entire system: "Reopen all files." This was no longer just a media response. It was a large-scale review where every complaint, every internal warning, and every faint note and old records were dug up and laid out on the table with no room left for evasion. In the Internal Affairs office, the light in the room was no longer the cold fluorescent glow, but the harsh light of truths long hidden. A middle-aged woman named Lara, a veteran member of the inspection team, was called back less than a year after her retirement. No one knew why Jeremy personally requested her, but Lara understood why. She was the only one who had spoken out about Doyle and also the one who was reassigned for a lack of cooperation with colleagues. In front of Leora was a stack of files so tall that she had to study them with her hands to keep them from toppling. She didn't need to read through them all. She remembered every detail, every instance where Doyle had been accused of using offensive language while conducting searches on black people in the southern parts of the city. Every case where Riker was accused of conducting body searches without legal justification. All of them ended with the same generic line: no sufficient grounds to conclude misconduct. She had once made notes of her objections, but those notes had been crossed out or erased. Now she placed them back on the table, and this time no one dared to stop her. Outside, human rights organizations' legal teams began submitting Freedom of Information Act requests. An organization called Equal Justice Project launched a digital map of the areas where Doyle and Riker had patrolled. The recurring pattern was undeniable. Where black populations were high, there were more complaints, and notably, the number of stop and frisk or administrative search records was nearly 3 times the average. These statistics no longer resided in the closed reports of the Oversight Board. They appeared publicly alongside photos of victims who had been harassed but never heard. Meanwhile, local prosecutors received an unusual request to review all criminal cases involving Doyle and Riker in their roles as arresting officers or witnesses. The reason? Suspicion of manipulation of processes and tampering with evidence. This had never happened with 2 active officers before, but this was no longer a personal matter. This was a warning to the entire system. If people like them continued to hold power, every conviction was at risk of being skewed. Elsewhere in the city, Malikika's legal team began receiving numerous collaboration offers from civil rights organizations, both in state and out of state, but Malikika declined all interviews. She didn't need to speak. She knew that every piece of evidence uncovered was a voice for her, clarifying what had happened. And even though she didn't step into the investigation room, her call, a frantic, desperate, trembling call, still echoed. In every record, they heard it, and now they had to answer. At the Central Police Department, the air was thick like the sky before a storm. Doyle and Riker still showed up, as usual, but no one spoke to them. Colleagues' gazes became either avoidant or cold. Nods replaced greetings. Some of the people who were once close suddenly submitted transfer requests to other departments. In the break room, the TV broadcast the news about the incident, causing the whole room to fall silent. One person quietly turned off the remote, not because they didn't want to listen, but because they couldn't bear seeing the badge they wore dragged through the mud. Doyle tried to maintain his tough exterior, but the confusion was evident in every clenched fist, every hurried step. Riker was different. He didn't say anything, but when asked to temporarily surrender his weapon for internal use, he smiled coldly and said, "Afraid I'll shoot again." No one laughed. No one reacted. The officer retrieving the weapon merely bowed his head and noted it in the record. For Riker, the silence was scarier than any shouting. Meanwhile, a special investigative team was formed for the first time. It included representatives from outside the department, including a sociology professor, an ethnic psychology expert, and a former independent judge. They were not only investigating specific behaviors, but the entire structure that allowed those behaviors to occur and be covered up. In one of the first meetings, they played the original video filmed in the supermarket, not edited, not altered. In the closed room, members watched the scene of Malikika being dragged down, hearing every taunt from Doyle, every glare from Riker. No one spoke for the first 10 minutes. By the 11th minute, an elderly female professor turned to the police representative and asked, "How will you teach your daughter to go to the supermarket after watching this?" No one answered. Outside the public eye, protests continued, but they were no longer an outburst of anger. They became organized actions. People printed shirts with Malikika's image and the words, "I'm still standing." Children were brought by their parents, holding signs that read, "My mom deserves dignity." Law student groups started holding seminars on law enforcement reform, using this case as a starting point. A prestigious university invited Malikika to speak. She declined, but they still held the event, inviting mothers who had gone through similar experiences. Hundreds of people came to listen, and everyone mentioned Malikika's name as a symbol, not of a victim, but of someone who refused to be silent. At the mayor's office, the first draft of police reform was placed on the table. It included mandatory recording of all interactions, not just from surveillance cameras, but from the police themselves, random checks on stop and frisk records, and most importantly, the establishment of a community council with the authority to veto disciplinary decisions within the department. The draft was not perfect, but it was a start, and for the first time, Jeremy signed the document not as a politician, but as someone indebted to the past for an apology. Behind it all, Malikika remained silent. She demanded nothing. She didn't file a lawsuit. She only asked for one thing: all the security camera footage from the supermarket that night to be made public, unedited. That was the final request she sent via email to the investigation team, and the closing line of the email read, "Don't let the next generation have to guess what happened." In the small room among the dusty files, the story of a single mother dragged down in a supermarket aisle had become a blow to the entire power system. And this time, that system couldn't turn away. Not because Malikika made a scene, but because she stood up. The whole city had to bow its head and face it. The suspension order didn't come like thunder, but quietly, like an envelope sliding across a desk. A memo. No headline, no special markings, just two bolded names: James Doyle and Brent Riker. When they walked into the administration room, every eye avoided them, and no one spoke. The secretary handed over the envelope without daring to meet their gaze, her trembling hand placing it on the desk. Doyle grabbed it, tore it open, and read each line in silence. There were no warnings, no opportunities for rebuttal, just a temporary decision for the sake of the investigation. Neither of them was handcuffed nor arrested, at least not yet. But their weapons were confiscated, their access badges deactivated, and their names immediately disappeared from the timekeeping system. The silence in the room was so thick that even the smallest sound could have made it explode. Riker stood up, turned, and looked around. No one responded, not a single regretful glance. They left the station without anyone seeing them off. The door closed behind them like a silent sentence. The department's internal communication system was frozen immediately after. All emails related to the two officers were moved to legal. ARCHIVES, and a special investigative team was assigned to investigate how the system had ignored the issues. Young officers who had stayed silent during late-night shifts were now brought in to give their recorded testimonies. Many lowered their heads. Some cried and a few held firm. I didn't see anything wrong, but the footage and data told a different story. The media acted fast. Morning news outlets ran headlines such as "to officers suspended amid racial discrimination storm." And one major newspaper published an investigation titled "When Power Wears a Uniform." Inside, an image of Doyle laughing at an internal party, mocking black people with the words, "The black folks need to be taught a lesson once and for all," was shown as undeniable evidence. Malikika didn't speak out. Reporters still hunted for her, but she kept working night shifts, avoiding the cameras. Her son, Jordan, received letters from classmates with innocent yet meaningful words. "Your mom is brave," but Malikika never saw herself as brave. She simply chose not to remain silent, and that decision forced the city to confront the truth. At the mayor's office, Jeremy held a closed-door meeting with political advisors. Half suggested a reconciliation speech, while the other half urged stronger action for his political survival. He dismissed both, presenting a report showing a 60% drop in black people's trust in the police within just 2 weeks. This statistic, he said, needed a change in reality, not a speech. In a rare public meeting, Jeremy apologized without a prepared speech. "I allowed my people, especially the black women, to be disrespected. He then read Malika's name aloud. For the first time, a high-ranking official acknowledged the humiliation of someone in a supermarket, not as a victim, but as a witness, forcing the city to reflect. Meanwhile, a team of investigators worked with witnesses from the incident, and a young student provided the crucial video of the altercation. This raw, unedited footage showing Doyle threatening Malika and Riker grabbing her bag became the evidence that shook the system. Malika, standing on her balcony one evening, no longer saw herself as the woman dragged in the aisle. She still carried the scars, but now each one was a reminder. She recalled the feeling of being pulled to the floor, the cold of the tiles, the pain in her wrist, the sound of boots hitting the ground, and the mocking laughter echoing in the air. But what she remembered most was the moment she lifted her head and saw the camera light from the ceiling, a silent witness, a truth that couldn't be denied. Her son came out, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Mom, when will they apologize to you?" Malika bent down and kissed his forehead. "When they no longer think they are right." He didn't fully understand, but he nodded because he knew his mother was the only one who dared to say no, and that was enough to change everything. The next day, a press conference was held at the police headquarters. The speaker wasn't the police chief, but a special representative from the mayor's office along with a female lawyer from the community council. After a brief statement, they announced the official suspension had turned into a disciplinary investigation, with the possibility of criminal prosecution if there was enough evidence. Silence enveloped the room. A young reporter raised their hand and asked, "Will Malika be nominated to the newly established community council?" Working through the representative smiled. "She doesn't need a title to have a voice." And right then, another notification appeared on the side screen. The 2-minute video was broadcast publicly in the room filled with flashing lights. No one took a deep breath, they just listened and watched. And for the first time, the entire system had to listen to the voice of the person they had once ignored. Malika at that moment was sitting in the hospital break room. She didn't watch. She didn't need to watch again. She had lived through it. But in the hospital hallway, nurses and doctors gathered around the screen holding their breath. One nurse whispered, "That's Miss Malika," and no one said anything else. Because everyone knew that when an ordinary person stands up, power must kneel. When the video was officially spread across the front pages of news websites and primetime broadcasts, the entire city felt slapped in the face by a raw truth. The police were no longer protectors, but the ones causing harm. No one needed to shout or analyze what was happening. Just looking at Malika's face when she was pressed against the shelves, or how Doyle used his hand to shove the milk crate to the floor, was enough to make all biases collapse. A whole system trained to control was now being judged by public opinion, and there was nowhere to hide. In a small cafe by the street, a group of college students set up a projector and replayed the video on the wall. A girl with glasses, her eyes red from anger, whispered, "My mom was once treated like that. I remember she didn't speak for 2 days. Beside her, a young white man lowered his head. "I didn't know it was that bad," he said, as if he were seeing the pain for the first time. The video didn't need guidance, no background music, no effects, but its weight was far greater than hundreds of petitions. The city's high schools began hosting class discussions, not because of a mandate from the Department of Education, but because the students demanded it. Many of the children stood up and said that their parents had always told them, "Stay silent when you meet the police. Don't ask. Don't argue." Now, they asked, "Why should we be silent to survive? We should be able to live without fear." A female teacher left the classroom in the middle of the lesson, unable to continue because she was crying. At the mayor's office, Jeremy stared at the newspaper from that morning. The front page showing Mala surrounded by 2 officers, her face tilted up beneath the supermarket lights, and blood still staining her cheek. He placed the paper down on the desk, closed his eyes as if trying to recall every decision he had ignored. He knew that call that night wasn't a random phone call. It was a wake-up bell ringing directly into the decaying structure of power. The meeting between him and Malikika was held behind closed doors, but its existence quickly leaked. Public opinion was immediately stirred. Some hoped, others doubted. Some called Malikika a heroine, while others thought she was becoming a political tool. But Malikika, who had been dragged to the floor, still chose silence. No press conferences, no statements. She returned to the hospital and continued her shift as before. The only difference was that her colleagues now looked at her with entirely different eyes. Not pity, but respect. On a midweek evening, she was invited to speak at a community event. She hadn't planned to accept, but Jordan said if Mom doesn't speak, someone else will tell the story wrong. So, she stood there on a small stage in Central Park without notes, without a teleprompter. She just told her story. I'm a nurse. I'm used to blood, to pain, but the wound that night didn't bleed. It was in my son's eyes when I returned to the car. The entire square went silent, holding its breath. After her speech, a flood of emails, messages, and calls came in from people who had witnessed Doyle and Riker's abuse of power, from former supermarket employees, from a doctor who had been interrogated just because he drove a black car. A middle-aged man sent a photo of the shirt he wore when Doyle dragged him out of the car. No matter how many times I wash it, I still smell the fear. And for the first time, he dared to admit that silence had killed him little by little over the past 2 years. The police department had to call an emergency meeting. Old files that had been dismissed due to insufficient evidence were opened one by one. Citations, reports, complaints, and audio recordings. The names Doyle and Riker appeared more than anyone else's. A new inspector, not from the city, was brought in to ensure fairness. He said nothing to the press, only handing each officer a sheet of paper with one line, "If silence isn't complicity, prove it." In another development, the former manager of West End Supermarket, who had looked away when Doyle insulted Malikika, suddenly submitted his resignation. In a subsequent post, he admitted, "I learned one thing. Not seeing doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But pretending not to see, that's betrayal." That post spread like a lesson, not from a good person, but from a coward who dared to admit his wrong. Jordan still went to school every day, but now he carried a small notebook. In it, he wrote down everything his mother had said. Don't let anyone tell you you're worthless just because you're silent. History doesn't change when people are right. It changes when people refuse to accept what's wrong. Those words written in his young hand had now become a declaration for a generation that had witnessed what the adults had once denied. One late afternoon, Malikika walked past the place where the incident had occurred. The shelves had been rearranged. The cameras still quietly recorded. A new employee who had just started last week recognized her and nodded. No words were exchanged, but that look was enough for Malikika to know. Her story was no longer just an incident. It was a turning point. As she left the supermarket, her phone rang. It was from a woman named Vanessa, the former wife of a police officer who had once been threatened by her husband's colleagues for reporting abuse. Vanessa choked up and said, "Because of you, my daughter no longer has to whisper every time she talks about the police." Malikika paused for a moment, then replied, "We don't need to scream to change. We just need to speak and not have our mouths shut." No one knew exactly when the official investigation began. There were no alarms, no sudden news broadcasts. But in the air, a subtle but irreversible shift was palpable. The hands that once gripped tightly within the system began to loosen, as if the entire power structure was realizing that what kept it standing wasn't the law but fear. Malikika didn't go to the hospital for 3 days. The lawyer from the civil rights organization recommended by Mayor Jeremy advised her to rest and stay out of the media. But the silence wasn't restful. She lived in a small apartment on the west side of the city where neighbors left food at her door without knocking. Each step in her apartment echoed with the memory of Doyle's footsteps from that day. And whenever light touched the mirror, she could almost see Riker stare over her shoulder. No one drew a gun, but she had never felt so close to death as she did that night. Meanwhile, at the police station, the internal investigation team began calling witnesses. People who had been interrogated by Doyle and Riker in unfiled cases started to come forward. An elderly woman trembled as she recalled how Riker threatened to throw her in the patrol car for crossing the street at the wrong time, just because she refused to hand over her papers while shopping late at night. When asked why she didn't file a complaint, she responded, "I live alone. I know they know where I live." Over 30 complaints were unearthed. Some were marked as insufficient evidence, others suspended, but this time, security camera footage from businesses around the West End supermarket spoke for the people. One video from a laundromat across the street showed Doyle stepping out of the patrol car, face stone cold before speaking to Riker and pointing at Malika's car. The footage was silent, but their faces clearly prepared for a night hunt. When the footage was sent to the investigation team, a young officer in the viewing room immediately clenched his fist. They knew she was there before they even entered. They targeted her from the street. A former investigator looked at the video, sighed, and confessed, "No one looks like that when they're just checking documents." Doyle and Riker were called in separately. Both chose to remain silent, exercising their legal right. But what made this hearing different was their gaze. Not the gaze of those in control anymore. Riker, who once smirked when being filmed, now gripped the chair like it was the only thing holding him in that room. Doyle was silent, but his eyes darted around as though his mind was scanning for every mistake that could be uncovered. And, as they feared, the team didn't just ask about Malika. They asked about cases they thought had been buried forever. A small detail changed the atmosphere. An anonymous letter was sent to the investigation team's inbox. Inside was a printout of an internal email from 2 years prior, where Doyle reported on a black woman loitering around the supermarket late at night and suggested handling it quickly to avoid tarnishing the neighborhood's image. The sender was unknown, but that was enough to trigger a new interdepartmental investigation into how the system had been running. At the same time, Malika received an invitation to work with 3 human rights lawyers, not to sue, but to protect. She wasn't the plaintiff, but she was the most vivid witness to a system now exposed. They prepared everything for her: personal security, safe travel routes, even a psychological advisor if she wanted one. But Malika refused to meet with a psychologist. "I'm fine," she said. "I've lived with this for years." I just never said it out loud. During the most tense days of the investigation, something unexpected happened. A boy named Marvin, Jordan's classmate, came to her with a small USB drive. Inside was video footage from Marvin's smartwatch that night. The boy had walked past the supermarket with his mother and recorded a few seconds of Doyle grabbing Malika's arm. The mixed sound captured Riker's voice. "I'll make you wish you weren't born with this skin color." That small USB became the final piece that forced the system to bow down. At the emergency hearing, the head of Internal Human Resources spoke before the committee. "No one in that video deserved to be treated like that, and no officer should ever create scenes like that." The statement was broadcast live. It spread on social media with the hashtag "Don't Look Away." A community campaign began, initiated by students. Their banner read, "Our eyes are open, and this time we won't look away." At home, Malika sat in the kitchen, the late afternoon light filtering through the window, casting her shadow on the wall. Jordan sat on the chair, marking the days she'd be working next. He turned to her and asked, "Mom, are you scared?" Malika looked at her son for a moment before answering, "Yes, but silence is scarier." The atmosphere outside City Hall was thick, like before a storm. On the stone steps, hundreds of people stood silently from early morning. No shouting, no slogans, just one thing: silence. But this silence was not weak. It was the loudest voice of a community that had been pushed into darkness. In their hands, each person held a piece of white paper with just one line written on it. She spoke. "Now it's our turn." Inside, Malikika walked down the rows of old wooden chairs in the hearing room. She wasn't wearing her usual white blouse. Instead, she wore a simple dark brown dress, if trying to blend in to make herself as ordinary as possible. But the way people's eyes followed her didn't allow that. Today, she wasn't just a witness. She was the collective memory embodied in flesh and a real voice. In front of her was the witness table. Behind it sat the city council. Jeremy sat at the center, his hands clasped, his eyes more hollow than usual. A space had been set aside for the two main figures, Doyle and Riker, but they never showed up. Their lawyer requested a delay in the hearing due to emotional instability. Some people snickered. Others went silent. Malika didn't react. She simply waited for the moderator's signal before standing. Malikika began, "On that night, I didn't want to become a symbol. I just wanted to buy milk for my son." Her voice was steady, each word shaped by sleepless nights. "I thought if I didn't resist, I'd be safe. But I was wrong because for some, the color of your skin is enough to be convicted." A soft cough came. From the back of the room, Dennis, a middle-aged man in a worker's uniform, introduced himself as a former security guard at West End. "How is he?" They turned away when Malikika was stopped, he said. "Because I thought if I didn't intervene, I wouldn't get in trouble." He paused, lowering his head, then added, "I missed the chance to protect a mother, and that will haunt me for life." Dennis's confession sparked others to speak up. An elderly woman trembled as she recalled, "I once saw a young black man pushed into a car for talking on the phone outside a store. I thought he was causing trouble, but today I realize. I learned to doubt the victim instead of the perpetrator." For the first time in years, the city council stayed silent, listening as if all past meetings had been practiced for this moment. When Malikika returned to her seat, Jeremy nodded and said, "You don't need to prove anything. It's our turn to answer." Meanwhile, backstage, the police department's lawyer submitted Doyle's internal report, which contained the line, "We have the right to stop individuals of suspicion in residential areas. They don't need to break the law to become a target." When this was made public, it ripped away the final mask of the system. That evening, the downtown area was lit by small candles. People gathered in circles, no chants, no banners. A girl around 8 years old stepped forward and read aloud, "My mom's name is Malikika. I don't want my mom to be the last victim." The girl was Vanessa's daughter, once silenced by the police when accusing her ex-husband. Today she spoke for all the adults who had stayed silent out of fear. Malikika didn't leave her house. Watching the live stream in the living room, Jordan, resting his head on her shoulder, asked, "Why aren't they testifying, Mom?" Malikika gently stroked his hair, "Because adults aren't always as brave as you think." She turned to look at the screen, seeing the crowd lighting up the boulevard. She knew she was no longer alone. The next day, Mayor Jeremy held an unprecedented press conference. Without documents or a prepared speech, he placed a mic in front of him and spoke harshly. "We've heard too many promises. Today, I'm here to say I apologize for allowing the people of this city, especially black women, to be disrespected, and I do not apologize just with words." He announced the creation of an independent oversight council chosen by the people with the power to investigate, access records, and suspend officers who violate ethics. The police department would be required to wear body cameras and store 30 days of data. Officers previously accused of misconduct would not be reassigned until their records were reviewed. No one applauded, but no one left. They stood in silence, realizing that an apology from someone in power could mean something if it came with action. In the small room on the east side of the city, Malikika sat quietly in front of the screen, crying for the first time. She didn't cry because of the victory. She cried because for the first time in years of wearing her white blouse, she didn't feel she had to prove her worth just because of her skin color. 1 week after the historic hearing, the Redlands Police Department held an urgent meeting, not due to any crime, but because the internal fractures were becoming impossible to ignore. The meeting room was crowded with faces that had once been silent, had once looked away, and had once signed off on reports without question. But that day, no one could hide. The walls, which had only known commands, now had to witness the first voices from within, voices filled with regret. Lieutenant Marcia Hill, one of the few black female officers in a supervisory position, stood in the middle of the room. In her hand, she held a thick file, internal reports that had been delayed, edited, or forgotten. She didn't look at the papers. She looked directly at her colleagues. "I've been silent for too long, not because I didn't know what was going on, but because I was afraid that if I spoke up, I'd be pushed out. But today, I don't want to play that game anymore. I want to be a police officer the right way." Her words weren't met with applause, but with the bowed heads of a few people. A young officer behind her nodded slightly and said, "I was also pressured by Riker to change the report. The incident in Harlem. I know that kid didn't do anything wrong. This confession wasn't planned. It wasn't in the reports, but it marked the first time in decades that someone in the system dared to speak the truth to each other." In the next 3 days, 13 self-reports were sent to the Internal Review Board, more than the total of the previous year, handwritten apologies, stories that had been suppressed under the guise of discipline, now piled up on the examination table. An older female officer from the records department walked in and placed a file on the table. "I was once asked to manage surplus information. Today, I'm returning it all." The change began to touch processes that had once been considered inviolable. Arrest orders were no longer hastily signed by a superior lacking the full facts. Suspension notices were sent to a senior officer, one who had tried to cover for Doyle by citing lack of photographic evidence. An internal survey was conducted. Anyone who had witnessed improper interrogations marked it. Nearly a third of officers marked it. No names needed, just the truth. Outside, the city began to shed its fear unexpectedly. Parents started taking their children to community meetings, not to protest, but to teach them to recognize right from wrong. An evening class run by volunteers called Justice Dialogue was created where residents and police could sit together, not to blame, but to understand what made the system so warped. Malika received an invitation from Mayor Jeremy not to speak, but to advise a newly formed group, the Human Dignity and Community Safety Advisory Organization, a seat on the council, not because she was a victim, but because she showed that one person can make the entire system reflect on itself. At first, she refused. She said she didn't know how to advise, but Jeremy responded, "It's because you've never been invited to the table that you need to sit there." The first meeting was held on the ground floor in what had once been an old press conference room. On the table, there were no microphones, no name tags, only blank paper and pencils. Malika sat next to an elderly woman, once a victim of an illegal search in 2009, and a young man who had been wrongfully detained for 2 nights simply because he had the same name. They weren't experts, they hadn't been trained in law, but they had something the system lacked: experience with wrongful judgment. A mid-ranking officer walked in, greeted everyone, and sat down with a tired expression. He was the first from the police side, and the first thing he said was, "I've never heard feedback from the people. Now I understand why they look at us like strangers." Elsewhere in the city, Riker and Doyle had yet to return to work. The investigative team had not yet announced the final verdict, but rumors spread that the Federal Department of Justice had requested detailed case files, suspecting systematic cover-ups lasting over a decade. Instead of being protected, those officers now had to face the law just like ordinary citizens. Malika didn't celebrate. She didn't post on social media or give a victory speech. She simply stood in front of the mirror every morning, put on her white lab coat, and looked herself in the eye. No bruises, no trembling, but one thing remained. Her belief that speaking out, even in small ways, could change something. She started spending every Friday afternoon teaching free classes to young black women, not just about health care, but about their right to respect. In one class, a girl asked, "Are you scared?" Malikika smiled. "You used to think you had to avoid other people's gaze, but now you know. You must look straight ahead." In the hospital hallway, the chief physician stopped when he saw Malikika pass by. He nodded and said, "You saved a life bigger than any emergency case." Malikika simply smiled and kept walking. Outside, the city was still noisy, with sirens blaring and unresolved cases. But in a part of the system once thought impossible to change, someone had dared to start. And once it started, there was no turning back. On a Monday morning, in a small meeting room behind the old police department headquarters, a man in a worn uniform stood up in front of a row of long wooden chairs. His name was Raylan Moore, a veteran officer, 32 years in the department. Once awarded a medal for quick response in a crisis, but today he wasn't there to receive more praise. He was there to confess. "We didn't call each other bad cops. We called it a brother under stress, and that was enough for no one to question anything," Raylan said, his voice raspy. "I've witnessed at least 5 incidents like what Malikika went through. Every time I stayed silent, I was scared. Scared of being pushed out of the group, scared of standing alone. But now I fear something else. Fear I'll die before I can fix what I allow to happen." His confession wasn't recorded, nor was it part of any official release. But in that room, with nearly 20 young officers attending a racial equity training, no one could keep a stoic face. One of them asked, "If someone like you was scared, how can we, the newcomers, be any different?" Raylan didn't respond with reasoning, but with one simple action. He removed his nameplate from his chest, placed it on the table, then returned to his seat and sat down like a regular person. "Start by not pretending you're blameless," he said. "Else we're in the city." Malikika sat in her new office with the Ethics Advisory Group. The room was simple, with white walls, a round table, and piles of unclassified documents. But this was where the first decisions were discussed. New standards for intervention procedures, retraining officers after complaints, and creating a anonymous yet fully protected reporting portal. Vanessa, the only friend Malikika had at the old hospital, walked in with 2 cups of coffee. "You know," she said, handing a cup to Malikika, "Jordan told my daughter the other day that you're the one who made this city change." "She cried," she said. "Now she believes that one day you'll finally be heard." Malikika gripped her coffee cup gently. She wasn't used to praise and even less to being seen as a symbol. But hearing Vanessa's voice, she understood. Sometimes silence is just as much a wound, and the right acknowledgement at the right time can be medicine. Meanwhile, inside the police department, a group of officers voluntarily established a new unit called Accountability Feedback, where colleagues could check behaviors, offer mental support, and notably report internal violations directly. No chain of command, no middleman records. Officer Jules, a young white man whose father was a sergeant, was the initiator. When asked why, he replied, "I'm tired of being seen as part of the violence just because of the uniform. If I don't act, then my silence is a weapon." Change began to emerge on every street. Patrol officers were now assigned in ethnically diverse groups. Emergency response teams had to include at least 1 female officer when the victim was a woman. A program called Touching Trust was implemented, where each officer was required to make 10 friendly interactions with civilians every week and record their reflections after each encounter. Jordan Malikika's son would often walk through the small market with his mother after school. One day, as they passed a parked patrol car, a female officer stepped out and gave a slight nod. Jordan squeezed his mother's hand harder. "Do you think she wants to help?" Malikika looked directly at the officer. If she starts by seeing you as a child, not an object, then B, she's on the right track. That weekend, Mayor Jeremy met privately with the advisory board. His voice, no longer as firm as before, said, "We've had 38 new testimonies come in, and for the first time in 10 years, an officer voluntarily requested suspension for retraining." He paused for a moment, then looked directly at Malikika. "I'm not saying this is a victory, but this is the first time we've stopped to listen." Malikika didn't respond immediately. She looked out the window where the late sunlight fell on the rooftops. "None of us is asking for perfection," she said. "We just need to see you step out of the shadow where power was used to avoid responsibility." That evening, when she returned home, Jordan was asleep on the sofa, holding tightly to a stack of scribbled drawings. Malikika gently pulled the blanket over him, then looked down at the drawing. It was of a woman standing in a crowd, holding up a sign that read, "I saw, I spoke, I matter." Malikika turned on the bedroom light, set her phone on the table, and opened the window. The night breeze brushed her cheek, gentle and cool, like the city was breathing again. On Wednesday morning outside City Hall, a group of high school students stood in a circle holding handwritten signs that read, "We are watching." No chants, no loudspeakers. Their silence spoke louder in its way. Each person in the group was the child of families who had been subjected to arbitrary checks pulled from their cars simply for having darker skin than the seats they sat on. Among them was a girl named Lean, the daughter of a driver who had been beaten by police right in front of their house. Malikika watched them from a distance, not stepping in, not taking photos. She stepped back to the corner of the street where the school bus had just stopped and picked up Jordan, who had his heart-shaped keychain on his backpack. As he stepped onto the bus, he turned to look at the older students. "Mom, why aren't they saying anything?" Malikika responded, not taking her eyes off the sign, "Because sometimes silence makes people listen more than shouting." That evening, a police station video was released. A closed-door meeting between the internal investigation team and 6 senior officers. Lieutenant Raylan Moore, who had confessed earlier, sat across from an elderly man, the deputy director of the oversight unit, who had spent years approving questionable files. In the video, he spoke slowly. "I thought silence was the way to protect the force, but it turns out it was the way to kill trust." The video wasn't intended for public viewing, but after Raylan's request and the approval of the others, it was sent to the city's media office. Within 48 hours, the video hit over 1 million views. The comments flooded in with not only anger, but a question. What do we do now to make sure we don't make that mistake again? Under intense pressure, the police department held a special public hearing, allowing citizens to share their experiences of injustice with legal protection. Malikika was invited as a key witness and supporter. She didn't arrive with speeches, but with a notebook containing handwritten notes from victims who had sent letters after hearing about the incident. In the large auditorium, the spotlight revealed faces that had only appeared in letters, midnight calls, and security footage. One man recounted being handcuffed while taking his daughter to the doctor. A woman cried as she recalled being twisted in a supermarket, and a 16-year-old showed his photo with a long bruise on his forehead, the only evidence he had. Malikika didn't interrupt. She simply sat beside them taking notes, occasionally placing a hand on someone's shoulder when they became too emotional. During the quiet moments, she thought of that night in the supermarket and realized what was happening now wasn't just atonement, but a new birth. No one was asking for forgiveness, but everyone hoped their voices wouldn't vanish as they had in the past. Just then, Officer Jules, who had initiated the internal response unit, stepped up to the podium. He didn't carry papers or prepared remarks, only his trembling but resolute voice. "I once dreamed of a promotion. I thought if I just kept quiet, I'd make it to the quick response team. But today, I want to speak up for the colleagues who were pushed aside when they tried to do the right thing." His words marked the beginning of a new chapter where those in uniform would no longer be seen as monsters, but as humans learning to serve again. The next day, a teacher in a local classroom showed her students the video of the hearing, asking, "Do any of you recognize someone in that video?" A student raised their hand. "Miss Malikika, my mom said she was treated by her at the hospital. She's gentle, but her eyes were really sad. Now I understand why." Malikika returned home late that night to find a letter on the table. No name, just a line. "I was the guard that day. I turned away. I carry that image every night. I've started telling everything to the investigators and I won't stop." She folded the letter without saying a word. Sometimes an apology doesn't need immediate forgiveness. It just needs to be heard. On her small bookshelf beside her files was a new photo frame. Jordan hugging her in front of their house, both smiling. Below it, Jordan had written, "Mom didn't stay silent, so now I get to speak." In the special hearing at City Hall, the main meeting room was filled, the media crowded behind, cameras focusing on faces that had been forgotten in faded reports. The presiding judge, once criticized for being too soft, for the first time, did not remain neutral. He spoke right away. "Today, I am not just the coordinator. I am here to listen." On the witness table lay a thick file, nearly 300 pages long, containing the preliminary conclusions from the Special Investigation Committee. At the top of the summary was the name Malikika Robinson, not as a victim, but as the central figure leading to a comprehensive policy change within the West End Police Department. Her testimony, the recording, the video shot from a distance, and especially her refusal to run or scream, but instead standing firm, looking directly at her oppressors, became the starting point for the entire reform. One officer, Riker, appeared for the first time after weeks of being out of the media spotlight. No longer in the uniform that had once silenced the supermarket, he entered wearing a gray suit, his face pale, flanked by two lawyers. When asked to speak, Riker remained silent for a long time. His eyes dared not look at anyone. His voice came out after nearly a minute. "I acted in the name of order, but I stripped away the safety of a woman. I will make no excuses. I don't expect forgiveness, but I am ready to face any judgment." The confession did not erase the crime, but it set things in motion. In the courtroom, no one clapped, no one shouted. There was only stillness, as if someone had just let go of a heavy stone that had hung in the air for too long. Outside City Hall, dozens of young volunteers handed out flyers about the Listening Checkpoint, a new initiative that allowed citizens to record negative experiences with law enforcement without needing to visit a police station. Just a recording, a message, or a testimony. Then the system would automatically encode and send it to an independent committee elected by the people. Malikika stood next to a large board with her face printed on it with the words, "From victim to anchor." A young man in his 20s, his arm tattooed with his mother's name, came forward and said, "You know, I was going to leave home that day. I thought no one would understand what it's like when your skin color makes people reach for a gun before you even speak. But then I saw your video and I thought, if you can stand still in front of that look, then I can keep going." Malikika didn't respond. She just nodded slightly, her hand resting on his shoulder. A small gesture, but in that moment, it was all that was needed. National television kept broadcasting the story, calling the incident at West End a milestone in redefining the role of the unformed. A Mater magazine article read, "Malikika's story is not because she was angry, but because she refused to let her silence be twisted." From a small supermarket at midnight, the event spread to the state legislature. The proposed law preventing abuse of police power included mandatory recording of all interactions during patrols and stronger penalties for officers who violate racial conduct rules. At the same time, the hospital where Malikika had worked sent an invitation for her to return. She was stunned when she received the letter. Not because it was a surprise, but because she knew when a door once closed due to cowardice opens because of respect, real change has begun. She decided not to return, not out of anger, but because she knew her role now lay elsewhere, where she could give a voice to those who had never dared to speak. In that modest office, Malikika and her team created a new training program for the police. Dialogue in the dark. Each officer would have to listen to a 10-minute monologue from a real victim without interrupting, justifying, or reacting. And the key part was the storyteller would not appear in front of them, only the voice in the dark to learn how to listen before learning how to control. During an interview with a children's channel, Jordan was asked, "Who do you think your mom is?" He didn't answer immediately. After a few seconds, he smiled. "My mom is the one who makes grown-ups change." That night, in the quiet of her small home, Malikika sat alone by the window, looking down at the street where Jordan was playing ball with a few friends. She no longer saw the bright headlights from that fateful night. She no longer felt the gaze of surveillance, no longer the sensation of being stalked in a city so accustomed to indifference. She saw something else. It was life. The sound of laughter, the bounce of the ball on the street, the image of a generation that could grow up without the burden of skin color being equated with guilt. And in that moment, Malikika gently closed her eyes, not to escape the past, but to hold on to a moment of peace, something she once thought was a luxury. As proof that justice, when reclaimed through resilience, is not a fantasy. Malikika's story is not one of great victory or a miracle that can only be seen in Hollywood movies. It is the story of a single mother, a nurse, an ordinary citizen standing up in a loud world and publicly revealing something that has been buried too long under unreasonable judgments and abuse of power. But what she did was not to change the entire world immediately. It was to change the way people perceive justice and what is right. The whole story started with a seemingly small event, yet it reflected a larger issue. Racial discrimination within the police force, the indifference of the system to the pain of the small and powerless. When Malikika was forced to undergo a check by two officers simply because of her skin color, she did not ignore it. She did not stay silent, nor did she hastily deny it. She chose to stand firm. And in that moment, throughout the following process, she was not only fighting for herself, but for everyone who had suffered from indifference and injustice from the system. Unlike other victims, unlike those who had been violated and only gritted their teeth in silence, Malikika spoke up. She did not ask for forgiveness, nor did she wait for others to realize she was wronged. She simply demanded one thing: recognition. A mother has the right to live without fear of the police simply because of her skin color. A woman has the right not to be seen as a threat just because she chooses to buy milk for her child. Malikika's story awakened many people, not just in West End, but across the country. The video in which she unwittingly became the central figure was not only proof of police misconduct, but it was also the voice of all those anonymous people, the silent victims of the past. What mattered was not that she became a symbol, but that she gave those who had lived in the shadows a reason to speak up. She was not seeking glory or recognition. She was seeking an undeniable truth, a truth that could not be avoided. Mayor Jeremy, who had previously always held his position firm and sometimes ignored social issues, was finally forced to reconsider. He surely understood that not just Malikika, but that countless others had been forgotten in a society with unjust rules. For the first time, he was no longer standing in a power suit, but as a father who had once let go of his daughter to walk her path and now realized that path had led her to the brink of public outrage. Not everyone has the courage like Malikika. Not everyone can stand up against the forces that have long defied their power. But Malikika's story, though not completely finished, was a turning point. A person can change their life, change the prejudices that have long been unspoken. When Malikika lifted her head in the supermarket, she wasn't the only one standing up. The whole community stood with her, no longer turning their backs or pretending not to see. From the story of a single mother, people realize that all pain can become strength as long as we dare to face it. A big lesson this story teaches is that justice is not something we can easily reclaim. It is not something that can be bought with money or power. Justice has to be built from small efforts from people like Malikika, those who dare to face the truth even though they know not everyone will agree with them. They are the ones who are not afraid to endure public scrutiny, not afraid to be criticized. And they are the force that changes the entire system. They may not change the past, but they can ensure that the next generation does not have to endure the same old mistakes. Malikika's story also shows that change doesn't come from strong punches, but from small, persistent, and unyielding steps. The world can change when we dare to speak up, face the truth, and continue fighting for what is right, even when facing tremendous opposition. Because silence is not golden. Silence can sometimes be the greatest crime when we fail to stand up. For the vulnerable, Malikika's story ends, but what she started has not. She not only won the fight against the officer's misconduct, but she also won the fight against the silence of society. And that is something we, those of us living in this world, must always remember. Justice is not something that allows you to stay silent. Justice is only justice when you dare to speak out. Malikika's story is not just an ending, but a beginning. It proves that every action taken to stand up against injustice, every voice daring to challenge power, can change the world. Malikika has become a symbol of resilience, showing that justice can never be defeated as long as we do not remain silent. The lesson from her will always be the guiding light for future generations, reminding us that change begins with small yet steadfast steps.